Good afternoon, everybody. First and foremost, thanks to the guys at Clico for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for turning up and tuning in. You might regret that in about 10 minutes. As you may have noticed, I am from the UK, and I'm from a little town called Gloucester, which is kind of in the southwest of the UK. We all talk a bit fast down there. We all sound like farmers. So if at any point during this presentation I say something you don't understand or I talk too quickly, let me know and I'll try and slow down and keep it at a reasonable pace. My name's Ellis Fincham. I look after our XDR practice here in EMEA for Rapid7. So I've got Belfast, Dublin, and Prague SOCs that sit under me, and also the software platform underneath it that underpins our services. So I see a huge amount of companies failing to keep their infrastructure secure, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the things that we see in that. The title of the presentation is probably a little bit combative, but it is the reality of the world at the moment. We are seeing organizations with 77 tools seems very small for some organizations, but just a quick show of hands in the room to make sure everybody's awake. In your organizations or in the organizations of your clients, does that number seem about right? Hands up if it does. Hands up if it doesn't. Hands up if you're awake. Well, I think we've battled with this a long time, and the reality is that I think we've got into this, not mess, because that would be a little bit derogatory, but we've got into this state where we've had problems arise over the last 10 or 15 years. Vendors like myself and others have come to you and said, hey, I can solve this problem. So you've bought that tool and it's solved that problem. But then when we start to think about it in a holistic way, actually we end up where we are at the moment, right? There's too much noise in most of our SOC environments. We are not getting to the alerts that we should be. Ponemon are saying, the average dwell time for most attacks is upwards of 250 days. And they were celebrating that because it's come down from 280 days. But for me, that's nowhere near where we need to be, right? For most organizations, if you are breached, within the first couple of hours, the attacker has probably got enough of a foothold in your environment to remain persistent regardless of the investigations you do. That's kind of what we're seeing within our organization. So how do we stop this happening? How do we get to a state where we have a fidelity in our alerts that allow us to understand the things that are important? And how do we get to a state where we're actually able to react in a consistent manner over time? Well, the first pleasure after giving the preventative measures a hard time for the last 5 minutes, the reality is, as these things emerge, we do need to start looking at our preventative measures. And as our defenses evolve, and we see more and more tactics in the wild that are repeatable, we need to be augmenting our defenses to make sure that they are dealing with those threats automatically, not one of you guys or one of the SOC analysts having to dig into data to go and find it. Now, we can't continue down the road that we have been and just endlessly buying tools. So I think for most of the security vendors out there, we're seeing them look to move laterally into other markets that are complementary to what they're doing. As a vendor ourselves, we focus on threat and we focus on risk in customers' environments and helping them with that. And the way that we've done that is by continuing along that path as it's evolved. So first and foremost, it was user behavior analytics, then we added log management, then we added EDR functionality, then we added SOAR, then we added network and something else and something else. But you get my point. The idea is you consolidate a lot of outcomes down into a single vendor, and hopefully that gives you some clarity around what's going on and means that you're not constantly in and out of consoles, looking at alerts in different places, having to constantly do that mental gymnastics to go, okay, this is the way that Rapid7 talk about this, but this is the way that Darktrace talk about it, or CrowdStrike, or whoever it happens to be. So getting those preventative measures to work in a consistent way is really, really important. But the reality is, and my company are going to, not be very happy with me now, but tough. I think it's important. The reality is, even if you get that right, and you've got, a global SOC with 450 people in it looking after 3 million endpoints, you still get breached. Because we do. We had 62 major incidents last year across our clients. And in terms of initial access, these are the vectors that those took. So this is attackers evading your preventative measures and breaching your organizations. This is the way that we saw it happening. Now, this is anecdotal, this is our data, but I would suspect that it looks something similar. You look at people like Hiscox, people like the Verizon data breach, and they're talking about the same things, right? Vulnerability management is poor in most organizations and leaves too many holes for attackers to exploit. Multi-factor authentication is difficult to implement, impossible to implement 100% across your organization if we're all honest with each other. Cloud misconfigurations is probably one of the rising stars we see in the attack vectors. Misconfigurations, S3 buckets left open to the cloud, keys to the kingdom left in GitHub repositories, that type of thing. We need to start being better at it. So how can we look at what's happened with ourselves, for example, with your organizations, and how do we get better? Well, the first thing I think we need to do, really, is look at how detections work in our environments. If you roll back 10 years, I think I was a slightly less grey-haired old man working at McAfee in their Nitro SIEM department. And the reality was we thought SIEM was going to work. We were going to bring all of this stuff together, and we were going to have one version of the truth where we could go looking for threats. And what it actually did for most organizations was create an impenetrable data lake that they had to go fishing on a daily basis to try and identify the threats that were happening in their environment. Or they had to buy some vendor-led security detections to layer on top of it to maybe get to where they were looking for detections. But that doesn't really help you, and it's often quite expensive. I don't know if anybody's a Splunk house here, but I don't think I've seen a PS bill for them for sort of under £50,000 in the last 10 years if you want to build a detection. It's an expensive job. So the way we've approached it at Rapid7 is by trying to give our organization context. And that means, yes, looking at the security tools that you've invested in and the logs coming out of them, but it also means looking at your traditional infrastructure as well, things like your Active Directory, your DNS, your DHCP logs, your LDAP logs, to try and look for correlations across users and assets in your business where you can make those decisions. Hey, Jane in accounts works Monday to Friday, 9 till 5. She uses these services. She accesses from this laptop and this location on a regular basis. Anything outside of that, we can then go and have a look for. But you can also overlay attacker behavior, right? Let's have another quick show of hands. How many active attacker playbooks do you think there are in the wild at the moment? And I'll do it. I'll start. Do we think, hands up if you think it's more than 1 million? More than 1,000 active attacker playbooks out there? Less than 500? Less than 250? The accepted wisdom is there are probably 250 active attacker groups out there. So if we look at the commercial guys, the APTs, the Cozy Bears, those types of guys, those probably account for about 120 of the attacker groups out there, the attacker playbooks that are out there. Now, cyber activists, mischief makers, those kind of guys, let's take a conservative estimate and say that they account for another 100, and let's assume we don't know about some. That isn't as insurmountable as we make the problem seem, I think, in the industry. We spend an awful lot of time saying, like, they've got to get it right once, we've got to be right every time. But actually, we don't have to be right about everything. There is enough intelligence out there around the types of attacks that these guys leverage at us that should allow us to make detection decisions based on that activity. And that's, that from a Rapid7 point of view, that's what we've done to help our SOC, is get those attack playbooks that are live in the wild built into a detection framework that sits across the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So those initial access methods we were talking earlier, right the way through to, to breach. If you can do that well, you can stop chasing your tail and playing whack-a-mole with your organization and constantly dealing with threats. You can concentrate on things that are actually happening. And if you can concentrate on the things that are actually happening, you can start to make decisions to help your business. And that's the next thing really I want to talk about is response to the activities that you identify is just as important as identifying those activities, right? If something happens in your environment in the middle of the night and you don't get to it for 6 hours because, God forbid, you go to sleep, that can be disruptive to you as an organization. And I'll use us as an example, 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't take automated actions for our clients because, as you can imagine, our legal department had kittens when we said we were going to start taking users and assets off of customer environments. So we spent 6 months building a data argument as to why we should be doing it. And we have the ability to take users offline, to take assets offline within the tool itself, but that's not why I'm not saying we're great, and that's not why I'm making this point. The point is, we had the ability, and we were sending out alerts to customers, and it would take them on average 6 hours to take that action. And I'm talking about, I send you a communication with, please click this link, and that will take that asset offline. And we were still waiting on average 6 hours. What that means is, instead of one asset or one user being affected by this attack, we had up to 200 being affected by those attacks in that 6-hour lead time. Now, bad in terms of contamination in your environment, but even worse for you as security professionals in terms of cleanup. You imagine rebuilding 200 machines, I would rather jump off of something high. But that's the reality of where we were. Now, but if you can close that gap down to 15 minutes, which is what we went back to our legal team and said, can we please do this, then you do get those kind of 1 or 2 assets affected. And what that means for you as organizations, it means you're not walking in the next morning to your whole infrastructure on fire. So getting these kind of consistent containment responses. I'm not talking about rebuilding your infrastructure automatically, like when you see these types of things. I'm just talking about throwing a net around it so that it doesn't cost you the earth the next day when you come to remediate it. And if we can do that consistently, and we have been for the last 4 or 5 years now, that helps reduce workload. And I'm not whilst it is wonderful as an outcome for our customers, within 15 minutes it's contained, I'll tell you who else it's wonderful for, me, because I've got less instant response engagements that I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So I don't have to get my big, hairy, expensive instant responders out to help these customers. We just take that asset offline and deal with it when somebody's in. Now, we probably shouldn't pat ourselves on the back too much because containing the attack is only half the battle and is only half the story really for most of us as organizations. When we are attacked, there is data in those attacks that helps us understand how vulnerable and where our infrastructure is vulnerable. And we should be using that intelligence to feed back into our risk management strategy to allow us to close the doors and windows that attackers that are actually targeting us are using on a day-to-day basis. And now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you recover from attack and in your instant response or your digital forensics afterwards, you map out the attack path, and one of the things that this attacker has used is a vulnerability in your internet-facing firewall, but also maybe leveraged a macro within your user base when they've actually got to a computer. Those are 2 things that you can look at, right? I can block an IP address on my firewall, or I can patch the vulnerability in that firewall. That means I've got less option of being attacked. But also I can maybe change our policy on macros. Maybe I stop everybody having to use them, and please, that will be my preference. But the reality is, we have applications that do use them, and we have users that need them. That's fine. But at least we are making a decision based on things that are being targeted at us. Now we can take that a step further. I think there's friends in the room from Recorded Futures. We have a threat intelligence platform as well. We should be taking the indicators of compromise that we pull from an attack and looking at what those mean externally and seeing where we can attribute them to. Not just to say to our bosses, hey, this was Cozy Bear that have targeted us, but to just look at the other types of things they're doing. If I know I'm being targeted by that particular attack group, what other initial access methods have they taken? Am I susceptible to them? Can I build a plan to close those doors and windows in front of them so they can't breach me in the first place? That's the type of mitigations, I suppose, that are making a real difference to customers. Closing the doors, being preemptive, having a bit of a view of what goes on. Now, that's quite a lot of work to do as an individual yourself, but you should be leveraging tools to help you do that. In terms of data attribution, there's loads of automated workflows out there that will allow you to kind of push your indicators of compromise up automatically to get that information back. There's loads of attack methodologies out there and information about them that will allow you to understand kind of how things have actually been executed. And that's kind of the place I want us to get to. Now, I am going to acknowledge that I don't know an awful lot about water polo, but other than it's probably the national sport of Hungary. But I want to use water polo as an analogy. Normally, I use rugby, as you can probably tell. I'm a bit rugby-shaped. But it's the same principle. Within your team, you will have two sets of skills, right? You will have those guys who are attackers, flair players, the guys that will put pressure on defenders, make them make mistakes, profit from those mistakes, and go on and score goals. And then you have your defenders who are looking to do the exact opposite, right? They're looking to train themselves and drill themselves so well that when the opposition attacks, they've got the answers. And if you think about those two sets of people through the lens of cybersecurity, the attackers are more SOC analysts, those guys who are reacting in real time to things that are happening and looking to shut those down. And the defenders are more like our governance and risk and compliance colleagues, right? They are winning through frameworks, by adherence to frameworks, by making sure that we're doing the right things in terms of auditing and compliance, and we're getting there. Now, the reason that Hungary won the 2004 Olympic Games, because that's the one I remember because I'm old, was because they could do both, right? They could do both at the same time. They were able to have structure around their game to allow them to defend well, but they also had those players that could go up and score goals. And if we can get to that nirvana where we're not just constantly playing whack-a-mole with what's going on, and we're able to automate the responses that we need in terms of containment, in terms of mitigating risk within our infrastructure, then we help our colleagues in risk and governance by not just adhering to frameworks, because I don't know about you guys, but I don't know anybody who stopped a security breach by adhering to a framework. But if you're doing the right things in your defense of your organization, the data that those guys want from a GRC point of view should automatically be there, because those are the things that you are concentrating on as a security professional. Now, it would be remiss of me to not tell you how wonderful Rapid7 is at this and how we're doing it, but the reality is I want to kind of know from you guys, we're looking at the lens of cybersecurity through risk and threat. And I think there's quite a lot more that needs to happen in order for you guys to be effective. There's Rick Howard, ex-CISO of Palo Alto, talks about 5 key principles for security success, all based around the first principle of mitigating attacks or mitigating the risk of attacks over a 3-year period. And those 5 areas are, intrusion, kill chain prevention, all the things I've been talking about in terms of detection and response to your organizations, but automation is also a key feature. Resilience is a key feature, and zero trust is the last one that he looks at. Now, all of those, I think, vendors have used interchangeably as their product output. Hey, come and buy my zero trust architecture product. Come and buy my incident detection response product. Hey, but the reality is you're going to have to do all of that, and all of those things should be driving information either bidirectionally or helping each other to win. You know, when I think about zero trust, I'm thinking about identity and access management, privileged access management, vulnerability remediation, cloud configuration, those types of things. And that's where you guys should be working. And if you haven't already, I'd really kind of recommend Rick's First Principles book. It's very accessible, but also is practitioner focused. So there's a lot of outcomes in there that you guys can maybe benefit for or talk to your customers about. Now, who was listening? I've got one prize. If you can tell me how many breaches Rapid7 dealt with last year in their managed services departments. All of them. It was a little bit lower than that, but yeah, a lot of them. 62, good man. Listen, I hope that's been useful. Before I close up and kind of move on for the next speaker, do you guys have any questions? Is there anything I've raised today that you want to go, bullshit, Ellis? Or any questions that I may have jogged loose in your brains? Such a well put together presentation. Nobody's got any questions. That's fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you again to Coleco for inviting us over. See you soon.